Well, it's good to see you. Oh my, I didn't realize you were also in my closet. Let's talk about Washington Irving. Specifically, as we looked at on the stream this week, how to create an image that sticks. An effective image that's really vivid in the mind and stays in the mind. This week, looking at Washington Irving's short story, Rip Van Winkle, we saw some ways to do that well, some ways to do that poorly. So, let's start with some ways to do it in a more positive light. The first thing to note is that when you're describing a place, assuming you're talking in the past tense, there are two ways you can describe it, which is a definite past or an indefinite past. When you speak of something as in the sense of a specific time and place, sometimes that can bring the reader more present into the moment, instead of talking about it as if it has happened throughout this period of time. So that's just good to note, because in Rip Van Winkle, he stayed in this indefinite past for a long time, the narrator. And you just start to feel disconnected from the story after a while. And then he does snap into that definite past at a certain point, and you start to feel more engaged. But he really just drags out that indefinite tense too much. Immediately the story goes into describing this mountain range. And here we see the first use of image. And what was most striking to me is sometimes he had these really gorgeous descriptions that, they really grabbed you. And other times you just kind of was like, what does that even mean? I can see that. It's just not intriguing at all. And I think some of the main factors, here, I'll mention two that I think were really prevalent. One is this idea of motion, of verbs in your description. Of how in one sentence, a thing just is there. A tree is there, a mountain is there. But in the next sentence, the clouds are actively reaching around the mountain. And the light is doing something to the trees. And that just that action really a description can be very dull and hard to get through because there's no dialogue, there's no action. So if you do infuse your descriptions with action, they can oftentimes draw the reader more in, and then the image gets into their mind better and therefore stays in their mind better. Another thing that Irving, at one point would do well and then at a next instance do poorly was this idea of specific versus general terms, adjectives or nouns specifically. What I mean by that is in one sentence he'd talk about, specifically the mountain slopes or the trees or something like that. And you get a specific, shape, a specific color. And then in the next sentence, he uses this bland generic word like landscape, and you don't really get this image from a word like landscape. It still gets the idea across, but it's kind of wasted opportunity to create a fleshed out, vivid image. Now, I think that, though I've been talking about this in terms of landscape, soon in the story starts applying to characters too. You have instances of people being described with these lame adjectives, and it's like, I don't really know what that means. I don't know what this kind of person looks like or how they act. They're a self-important person, but I don't really know, maybe tell me how they walk. But then you get another time where you get this image of this kind of judgmental old guy with this pipe who rules the opinions of the town, and you get this really clear image of what he is. So there you have the specifics versus the generic, just this adjective, self-important, to sum up a whole character in a very uninteresting and honestly pretty uninformative way. And the same goes for action. At some points you see the main character, Rip Van Winkle, you see him in action, how he interacts with people, how he's kind to them, and you're like, I would like this guy. But at other points, the narrator just goes on for a paragraph about he was a good guy, and just uses these really generic terms instead of giving you the specifics that are really going to make you understand and see his character. Now there's a couple more, I think, minor points about creating an image that I'll bring up here. One is one I like to bring up often, which is this idea of matching form and content. I talk about it a lot, so I won't dwell on it, but here's the example from the book that I was thinking is the narrator, well, it's set in this little town with kind of all these wise old guys, or at least old guys who like to talk like they're wise. And the narrator kind of takes on that character and uses like these maxims and little quips that he throws in there as the narrator. And that kind of like makes you feel, because of the narrator's voice, kind of draws you further into this image of what the town is like, of what the people in the town are like specifically. So there we have form, what's being said, and content, how it's being said, being combined to deepen our feeling of being in the town. And the second one is just really quick, over explaining an image, just adding more and more details onto an image. There comes a point where you aren't increasing the image, you're diminishing it, because it's too much for the reader. And I think a good test for this is if you read a description of a thing and you get to the end, and I don't mean you, the writer, but give it to someone else, and if they can't remember how the description began very specifically by the time they get to the end of it, your description's probably too long, and you're kind of diminishing the glory of whatever this thing that you think like needs a whole paragraph to be described. You're kind of taking away from that when you put in too much. The last thing wasn't really related, but I just thought it was interesting, so I'm just gonna try to bring it up. It's this idea of, if you're going to like be explicit about how someone is thinking, make sure you're pretty clear about like why they're thinking that way. That's vague. So here's the example that made me think that from the book. Rip Van Winkle, the story goes, he falls asleep in the mountains for 20 years and he comes back to his hometown. And the narrator kind of talks through his eyes, like he noticed this was changed, he noticed this was changed. But it's so odd, because Rip Van Winkle first like notices how like totally trivial things are different, but then goes on to notice eventually like, oh, the people are different, and more just obvious changes like that. And it's like, I don't believe that if this had happened, he would have first noticed like, oh, like the trim color on that house is different, or they changed their flag, instead of like, no one in this town is the same person, But that's just an aside from the main point. Anyhow, that's it. It's the main thing. Just some little tips for how to get a good image, either of a scene or of a character. I think any of this advice applies to both. If anything I said has been kind of vague, probably has been, feel free to come to the stream, where I'm actually like reading it and explaining it as we go. Or better yet, get the story for yourself, look at it, compare your notes with mine, see what you think. Even though I'm not super big into promoting Washington Irving, because I don't think he's very good. But, still things to learn, nonetheless. Anyhow, thanks for watching. Hope it was informative, hope it was fun. Now get out of my closet.